We live in an era defined by continuous breakdowns. Environmental disasters, wars, pandemics, political turbulence, misinformation, economic instability, and deep existential despair. For countless people, the sensation is unmistakable. The world feels like it's falling apart. And when we are surrounded by an unending wave of chaotic, painful, and unpredictable events, a profoundly human question emerges. How do you remain mentally stable when everything appears to be collapsing? This concern is not unique to our generation. Albert Camus, the Algerian-born writer and philosopher, lived through some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century Nazi occupation in France, the devastation of World War II, and the looming fear of nuclear destruction. He witnessed a world literally disintegrating, yet he refused to be swallowed by despair. Instead, he forged a bold and deeply countercultural philosophy about how to stay psychologically alive when reality loses its structure. A philosophy that still has the power to protect minds on the verge of breakdown today. Camus named this worldview absurdism. For him, human suffering does not come solely from tragic events, but from our desperate need to impose absolute meaning onto a universe that offers none. According to Camus, the real tension arises from the clash between our internal hunger for purpose and the indifferent silence of existence itself. And it's at this very intersection that many people lose themselves, trying to force explanations, patterns, or divine logic where perhaps none exist. Yet Camus did not embrace nihilism. He never claimed that nothing matters or that we should give up. Nor did he support the escapism of toxic optimism, the tendency to insist that everything will be fine without confronting the harshness of reality. To Camus, both denial and nihilism were pathways toward alienation and psychological breakdown. Instead, he proposed a third response, the absurd revolta way of living that accepts chaos fully, acknowledges the absence of cosmic meaning, and still chooses to act with dignity, compassion, and appreciation for the small fragments of beauty scattered through daily life. In this video, we will explore how Camus' philosophy of the absurd can help us stay lucid in an age of collapse. We will examine why searching for explanations behind tragedy can become a mental trap, how the plague illustrates solidarity as a stabilizing force, and what it truly means to remain sane in an insane world, not by escaping it, but by resisting it. In a world saturated with algorithms, conspiracy theories, and polarizing narratives that promise definitive explanations for every crisis, the idea that the universe might simply lack inherent meaning can feel not only unsettling, but even threatening. Yet this is precisely where Albert Camus plants one of his most radical insights. For him, psychological instability begins the moment we demand coherence from life and order, a justification that life never agreed to provide. Most people move through existence hunting for answers. We want to understand why terrible things occur. We hope there is a plan, that justice exists somewhere beneath the surface, that every moment of suffering belongs to a grand design. This longing is understandable, it is deeply human. But Camus argues that this very expectation, the insistence that reality must make sense, is what ultimately shatters us. Because the truth is that reality, more often than not, operates with brutal indifference. The universe remains silent. Pain arrives unexpectedly. Misfortune has no script. Death is inevitable, and no instruction manual accompanies existence. At the heart of absurdist philosophy lies this collision. On one side, the human craving for purpose and explanation. On the other, a universe that responds with nothingness. This rupture between desire and reality is what Camus calls the absurd. But contrary to what some might assume, this awareness is not an invitation to despair, it is the beginning of real liberation. When you stop insisting that life follow a coherent logic, frustration stops ruling you. When you release the belief that every tragedy must contain a hidden message, you also free yourself from the guilt of failing to decipher one. Freedom emerges the moment you understand that suffering is not punishment, that pain requires no cosmic explanation, and that chaos does not need to be fixed before you can live with integrity. It is here that Camus challenges both rigid religious dogmas, which promise comfort at the cost of obedience, and extreme rationalism, which assumes that logic and science can fully decode the mysteries of existence. In his eyes, both systems fall into the same trap, refusing to accept the absurd as part of the human condition. Recognizing the absurd does not equate to giving up. It means abandoning the search for an externally assigned meaning, and instead creating significance through your own lived experience. You don't live because life has a predetermined purpose. You live despite its lack of one. And this, Camus insists, is the fullest expression of human freedom. But not everyone can face this truth without becoming unbalanced. In the presence of the absurd, many choose to deny reality. Others collapse into nihilism. And these two paths, with their destructive psychological consequences, are what we will explore next. When the world begins to collapse, whether through a personal disaster or a chain of global crises, the human mind tends to react in familiar, almost automatic patterns. Camus observed that in the face of chaos and absurdity, most people gravitate toward two psychological escape routes. Both offer the illusion of immediate relief, yet both ultimately lead to fragmentation, emotional instability, and in extreme cases, madness. The first escape is denial. It is the stubborn refusal to acknowledge that something devastating is taking place. Individuals in this state cling to routines as if repetition itself could shield them from reality. They downplay danger, justify warning signs, and repeat hollow reassurances. It's not that bad. Things will go back to normal. This is just temporary. Denial constructs a parallel world, comfortable, tidy, predictable, but entirely false. Over time, the cost is immense. Chronic anxiety bubbling beneath the surface, emotional paralysis, and sudden psychological collapse when the illusion inevitably cracks. It is the mind suffocating beneath forced optimism. The second escape is nihilism. Here, the person recognizes the chaos, but responds by declaring that nothing matters. Meaning evaporates. Effort feels pointless. Life becomes a heavy burden rather than a possibility. This posture masquerades as cold realism. I'm just being honest. I'm not fooled anymore. But beneath this apparent clarity sits profound despair. The nihilist has not transcended suffering. He has been swallowed by it. It is a slow inner death where the body continues but the will to live withdraws. Camus was uncompromising in his critique of both reactions. To him, denial and nihilism are two sides of the same refusal, the refusal to face the absurd consciously and courageously. One hides behind delusion. The other collapses into hopelessness. Both reject reality. Both undermine mental stability. Both fail to engage with the truth that life carries no guarantees, no inherent fairness, no built-in meaning. But Camus offers a third response, far more demanding yet profoundly more liberating: the absurd revolt. This stance neither blinds itself to suffering nor becomes enslaved by it. Instead of escaping chaos, it confronts it directly, without despair and without illusions. This revolt is not a violent uprising or a dramatic emotional outburst. It is a quiet, steady decision to live truthfully within a chaotic world. A choice to resist meaninglessness without inventing fantasies. A refusal to surrender one's humanity to disaster. And it is this path, the only path that preserves sanity, that we will now explore. What does it truly mean to revolt against the absurd? How can someone act with dignity when nothing guarantees that their actions will change anything? The answer begins with a shift so radical that it feels almost paradoxical. In a universe without inherent meaning, where suffering is unavoidable and certainty does not exist, Camus proposes revolt not as rage, but as consciousness. This revolt is not a dramatic uprising, nor a chaotic emotional explosion. It is an inner stance, a disciplined clarity, a refusal to surrender your humanity even when the world appears meaningless. For Camus, absurd revolt is the deliberate decision to face reality exactly as it is, unstable, painful, indifferent. And yet, even knowing this, to continue acting with courage, lucidity, and moral fidelity. The person who lives in revolt does not wait for a divine rescue. They do not expect rewards, redemption, or a neat explanation for suffering. They know the universe will not respond, and still they respond to it. They understand they will never uncover a final truth, but they choose to live truthfully nonetheless. Their actions are not fueled by hope of victory, but by commitment to remaining human. Absurd revolt is a daily yes to life, even when life offers no assurances. It is rising each morning aware that nothing is promised and still choosing to do what must be done. It is allowing oneself to feel pain without transforming it into a false narrative about destiny or cosmic purpose. It is refusing to let hardship annihilate one's capacity to create, care, resist, and love. Camus describes this posture as fidelity to oneself amidst chaos. It is not blind optimism, it is the exact opposite. It is clarity that persists even when the world collapses. It is the power to hold on to one's integrity, even as everything around loses its shape. The revolted individual acts not because the outcome is secure, but because to stop acting would mean betraying the very core of one's humanity. This revolt is the purest expression of freedom. The moment you stop demanding that life give you meaning, you gain the freedom to create your own, not as a universal truth, but as a personal act of resistance. Every conscious gesture, every ethical decision, every small act of kindness becomes a defiant statement. I refuse to become less than human. Living this way does not eliminate suffering. It prevents suffering from becoming dehumanizing. It does not erase destruction, but it stops destruction from hollowing you out. It is living intensely precisely, because nothing is permanent, making each moment a deliberate assertion of your existence. Yet revolt is not merely internal. How does this philosophy manifest in a world collapsing collectively? How does it translate into real action when entire communities face devastation? To answer this, Camus gives us one of his most profound works, The Plague. And it is through that narrative that we begin to understand how revolt becomes concrete, how, in the midst of catastrophe, it transforms into solidarity, responsibility, and a quiet form of inner salvation. In The Plague, Albert Camus abandons any hint of softness or hopeful symbolism. Instead, he thrusts the reader into a city strangled by death, locked down under fear, and shaken by an epidemic that makes no moral distinctions. Oran, the backdrop of the novel, is an ordinary, even dull city, predictable, business-oriented, almost numb with routine, until suddenly it is frozen by a catastrophe no one can see, but everyone can feel. It is in this landscape of total paralysis that Camus tests his philosophy of the absurd, not as abstract theory, but as lived, relentless experience. What makes The Plague so devastating is that its characters do not triumph over disaster. They uncover no hidden meaning, no divine plan, no miraculous cure. The suffering is not redeemed. Many perish, others lose their sanity, and everyone is forced to confront the harshest truths about themselves. And yet, within this bleakness, some choose to stand up every single day and fight, not because victory is possible, but because they refuse to abandon their own humanity. Dr. Ryu, the novel's central figure, embodies this posture. He does not believe in supernatural explanations, nor does he cling to hope of a sweeping solution. He knows that most of the patients he treats will die. Still, he continues his work tirelessly, not out of optimism but out of moral responsibility. Camus uses Ryu to highlight a profound distinction. There is an enormous difference between wishing for a happy ending and choosing to do good, even when the ending may never change. This is the essence of Camus' message. Genuine compassion does not depend on guarantees. Real responsibility does not require the expectation of success. True kindness is the kind that persists in the dark, when no applause is coming, when no reward exists, when evil appears unstoppable. In this sense, sanity becomes a discipline of action, an ethical consistency sustained in a world that offers nothing in return. Sanity for Camus is neither a serene state of balance nor an unshakable inner peace. In a world where chaos is inevitable, where suffering strikes without warning and meaning is never guaranteed, sanity becomes something far more demanding, a daily practice of resistance. And this resistance does not reveal itself in heroic spectacles or grand gestures. It unfolds quietly in simple acts of compassion, in fleeting moments of beauty, in ethical decisions made even when no one is paying attention. Camus insists that even in a world that resembles hell, it is still possible and necessary to carve out small islands of humanity, a heartfelt conversation, a moment of shared silence, a gesture of help offered without expectation. These fragments of ordinary goodness do not erase the surrounding devastation, but they anchor us. They remind us that while we cannot control the collapse of the world, we can still choose the manner in which we inhabit it. This is why, in Camus' view, aesthetics, ethics, and empathy are inseparable. The absurd does not demand belief in a higher purpose. It demands presence. It asks you to act as if your existence matters, not because of some divine reward, but because that is how you remain whole. Sanity, then, becomes a matter of directing your attention toward what you can still touch. When everything appears to be slipping out of your hands, clarity begins in the smallest reachable corner of your life. You cannot stop a war, but you can soothe someone who suffers. You cannot rebuild a broken system, but you can be honest with the people around you. You cannot promise that tomorrow will be better, but you can act with kindness today. Importantly, Camus never romanticizes pain. He rejects the idea that suffering inherently ennobles anyone, but he firmly believes that our response to suffering reveals our character. Freedom, therefore, is not the absence of constraints. It is the ability to choose how to act when constraints are unavoidable. And this choice, though small and silent, carries a revolutionary force. In the plague, brief moments of joy shine through the darkness, a shared memory, a piece of music drifting through a window, a quiet evening conversation. These moments do not serve as escape. They function as subtle acts of defiance, sparks of life declaring, "I am still here, I am still human." Camus goes even further by suggesting that a kind of rebellious joy can emerge from persistence itself. In the myth of Sisyphus, he writes that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because the burden disappears, but because he transforms the act of pushing the stone into a declaration of existence. Meaning is not found, it is forged through action. This leads to Camus' most radical proposition: the world may be falling apart, but within that collapse, you retain the freedom to decide who you will be. And that choice, tiny, fragile, invisible to most, might be the very thing that protects your sanity. We've now arrived at the core of Camus' philosophy. In an absurd world, sanity is not something one receives. It is something one builds. And this construction demands far more than emotional resilience. It requires a fierce clarity, a rare form of intellectual courage, and an unwavering willingness to face reality without flinching. Camus offers no comforting illusions. He rejects sweet lies and anesthetic hopes. Instead, he proposes something far more difficult, yet infinitely more authentic: to acknowledge that life comes with no pre-assigned meaning, and still choose to live with integrity, awareness, and deep humanity. This is the ultimate act of rebellion. A rebellion without violence, without promises of salvation, and without certainty of victory. A solitary revolt that safeguards the only territory still within your control when everything else disintegrates: your lucidity. Lucidity, in this context, is not pessimism. It is honesty. It is the opposite of the emotional blindness that fuels denial and the antidote to the corrosive despair of nihilism. To be lucid is to accept that life is fragile, that injustice is real, that suffering is unavoidable, and yet still insist that something meaningful can be built among the ruins. This awareness is what makes freedom possible. Camus writes that freedom is worth no more than anything else, but nothing is better. And sanity in his philosophy is precisely that freedom, the ability to decide how you will live, even when you never chose the world you were placed in. Lucidity means recognizing tragedy as part of existence while refusing to let tragedy define your inner life. It means finding strength not in the fantasy that things will magically improve, but in the private promise that as long as you are alive, you will act as a force for honesty, kindness, and beauty, even if those actions last only a few seconds, even if no one notices, even if the world remains unchanged. This is absurd revolt at its highest point, a mental and moral posture in which, despite having no hope of rescue, you continue not because of faith, but because of choice. The choice not to become smaller than the world's brutality. The choice to keep your mind awake and your heart open. The choice to stand firm even in the presence of collapse. In the end, this is what true sanity looks like for Camus. Not peace, not answers, but a vigilant awareness that refuses to surrender. If you've reached this far, it is likely because you feel, as Camus once did, that the world is off balance, that something has broken, both outside and within. So now the question turns to you. How will you respond to this collapse? At this stage, Camus shifts the discussion from collective suffering back to the intimate battlefield of the individual mind. For him, sanity is not an inherited condition or a natural balance granted to some and denied to others. It is a daily construction, fragile, deliberate, shaped by small acts of presence and dignity. In a world where pain is unavoidable and meaning is never guaranteed, mental stability becomes a discipline rather than a gift. And this discipline rarely appears in heroic displays. It reveals itself in the quiet moments when a person chooses compassion over indifference, clarity over escapism, and integrity over convenience. He insists that even in the midst of devastation, it is not only possible but necessary to create pockets of humanity. A simple conversation, a gesture of kindness offered with no expectation of reward, a moment of beauty noticed while everything else collapses. These do not save the world, but they anchor the individual who experiences them. They become acts of resistance against both chaos and numbness. This is why, in Camus' view, aesthetics, ethics, and empathy are inseparable. They form the small but solid pillars on which sanity stands when the external world breaks apart. Maintaining mental clarity begins with returning attention to what remains within one's reach. You cannot halt the collapse of economies or the spread of misinformation. You cannot eliminate war or heal the entire world. But you can stay honest in your relationships. You can soothe someone's pain. You can choose not to become cruel, cynical, or detached. These choices seem insignificant on the surface, but each represents a refusal to surrender to the surrounding darkness. Camus never romanticizes suffering. He rejects the idea that pain necessarily elevates or purifies anyone. What matters, he argues, is how one responds to pain, whether it becomes an excuse to justify decay or a moment to affirm one's humanity. Freedom, in this context, is not the ability to control events, but the ability to choose who you become in the midst of them. And this freedom, though quiet, is revolutionary. These tiny acts of lucidity and kindness echo throughout the plague, where even in a city swallowed by death, characters still find scattered moments of joy, a shared story, a brief song, a fleeting memory. They do not cancel the horror, but they prove that horror has not won. They remind us, as Camus does, that you can remain human even when the world has forgotten how to be. For Camus, choosing sanity in a collapsing world is inseparable from a deeper form of lucidity, an unflinching clarity capable of confronting reality without demanding that it be different. Lucidity is not a permanent state or a serene enlightenment. It is a discipline of seeing suffering without romanticizing it, seeing chaos without exaggerating it, seeing the world without anesthetics or illusions. He refuses every comfortable escape, whether it comes in the form of blind optimism or despair dressed as realism. Instead, he proposes a path far more demanding: to stand fully awake in a world that offers no promises. This is why he argues that lucidity is the highest expression of freedom. When you stop begging life for coherence, when you no longer require a hidden purpose behind every tragedy, you reclaim your ability to make choices. You are no longer controlled by fear, disappointment, or the constant frustration of expecting the universe to justify itself. Freed from this burden, you become capable of acting with integrity simply because you choose to, not because you expect reward, meaning, or cosmic validation. Lucidity also means recognizing that tragedy is not an anomaly, but an intrinsic part of existence. And yet, Camus insists, this recognition does not condemn anyone to paralysis or bitterness. On the contrary, it gives you the strength to build something meaningful in the cracks of a broken world. The clarity to know that beauty is fleeting does not destroy beauty. It makes each moment more precious. The awareness that kindness may not fix the world does not nullify kindness. It confirms that kindness is an act of rebellion. This is why Camus places such emphasis on micro-gestures, the smallest displays of humanity that survive even in desolation. A choice to tell the truth, a choice to comfort someone, a choice to continue doing what is right even when no one will ever know. These choices are not grand or heroic, but they preserve the core of the individual who makes them. They prevent the collapse outside from becoming a collapse within. At its peak, this lucidity transforms into a stance of resistance. The world may not change. The suffering may not subside. But the lucid individual refuses to let external chaos dictate the shape of their inner life. They continue, not because they expect victory, but because continuing is the last affirmation of freedom available. We have finally arrived at the core of Camus' vision. The idea that sanity in a disordered world is not something granted by fate, nor a natural condition of the human mind. It is something forged, something earned. And what must be forged is not optimism, nor spiritual comfort, nor the pursuit of a hidden cosmic agenda, but a kind of fierce clarity. Camus asks us to cultivate a state of mind capable of seeing the world as it is, without embellishment and without despair. He rejects every soothing falsification. He refuses to pretend that life is fair or that suffering has a script. Instead, he calls for a lucidity that is both unyielding and deeply humane. This lucidity does not promise peace, it promises honesty. It offers the strength that comes from no longer bargaining with reality. To be lucid is to acknowledge that existence is fragile, that death is inevitable, that injustice is woven into the fabric of the world, and still insist that one can act with dignity. As Camus reminds us, freedom may not be worth more than anything else, but nothing surpasses it. And sanity, in his view, is this very freedom, the freedom to choose how to live even when the universe offers no explanations, no guarantees, and no consolation. To embrace lucidity is not to surrender to tragedy. It is to refuse to be devoured by it. It is to understand that nothing requires you to become bitter or cruel or numb. It is to discover that even in darkness, you can still embody truth, compassion, and beauty, even if only for brief moments, even if no one notices, even if nothing changes outside you. This is the ultimate revolt against the absurd, the inner decision to remain awake, to remain human, to remain whole. And so, if you have followed the argument to this point, perhaps you feel what Camus himself felt, that something is broken in the world, and perhaps something is trembling inside you as well. The question now is not whether collapse exists, it does. The question is, how will you respond to it? What inner struggle are you facing to stay sane amid so much uncertainty? Share it in the comments. And if this reflection helped you, pass it on to someone who may be losing their footing. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We still have a lot to explore together. Before you go, watch the next video. Sometimes a single new idea is enough to keep someone standing. Thank you for watching and see you next time.